A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You ever see those videos from the Mahsa Amini protests back in 2022, where guys on motorcycles are just plowing into crowds of unarmed people? Because that image has been living rent-free in my head ever since Daniel's prompt came in about the Basij.
Yeah, that's exactly the visual that captures what we're dealing with here. And Daniel's prompt is a great one. He wants us to dig into the Basij's history, its role in suppressing dissent, and specifically whether it functions as an internal intelligence and counterintelligence apparatus supporting the Revolutionary Guard. There's a lot packed in there.
There really is. And I think most people, when they hear about the Basij, they picture, I don't know, a bunch of thugs with sticks. But from what I've been reading, that's a pretty significant undersell of what this organization actually is.
It's a massive undersell. And that's one of the things I want to get into today, because the Basij is one of those entities where the popular image and the operational reality are miles apart. Also, a quick note, today's episode is powered by Xiaomi Mimo V2 Pro, our script engine, which helps us keep the research and structure tight.
Working hard behind the scenes. Alright, so let's start with the basics. The Basij, what is it technically? Because Daniel's asking if it's an intelligence apparatus, and I think the answer is yes, but also way more than that.
Right. So the Basij, full name the Basij-e Mostazafin, which translates roughly to the mobilization of the oppressed, was founded in 1979 by Ayatollah Khomeini himself, right after the Islamic Revolution. The original concept was a people's militia, ordinary citizens who would volunteer to defend the revolution against both internal and external threats. Think of it as Khomeini's answer to the question, who guards the guardians?
So it was born out of revolutionary paranoia, essentially.
Born out of revolutionary necessity from their perspective. But yes, paranoia is a fair characterization from the outside. The timing matters too. The Iran-Iraq War started in 1980. Just a year after the revolution, and the Basij became a critical manpower pipeline. We're talking about sending waves of volunteers, including very young volunteers, into combat against Iraqi forces. The regime discovered during that war that the Basij was not just useful for external defense, it was extraordinarily effective at mobilizing ideological loyalty.
And that lesson stuck.
That lesson became doctrine. After the war ended in '88, the Basij didn't demobilize, it pivoted. It became a permanent fixture, and in 1991 it was formally integrated into the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command structure. So today it's technically a branch of the IRGC, not an independent organization. That distinction matters a lot for understanding how it operates.
Okay, so when Daniel asks whether the Basij is preserving the Revolutionary Guard, the answer is partly that they're structurally the same entity.
That's the key point. They are structurally intertwined. The Basij reports up through the IRGC chain of command. The current commander of the Basij, or at least the most recently known commander, is appointed by the IRGC's overall leadership. So when we talk about the Basij preserving the IRGC, we're really talking about one limb of an organism protecting the whole body.
How big are we talking? Because the numbers I've seen are all over the place.
This is where it gets interesting, and where you have to be careful about what you're counting. The official Iranian government claims are absurd. They've cited numbers as high as 25 million members, which would be roughly a quarter of Iran's entire population. That's clearly propaganda. More realistic estimates from independent analysts put the active organized membership somewhere between 1 and 3 million people. But even that range is wide because the Basij has tiers.
Tiers?
Yeah, There's a core of full-time or near full-time members who are deeply integrated into IRGC operations, maybe a few 100,000. Then there's a larger layer of part-time members who train regularly and can be mobilized quickly. And then there's an even broader layer of nominal members, people who've signed up for various reasons, some ideological, some practical, because Basij membership comes with benefits like university admission preferences, cash stipends, exemptions from military service.
So membership isn't purely about ideological commitment. There's an economic incentive baked in.
Significant economic incentives. And that's actually a double-edged sword for the regime, because it means your base of loyalists includes a lot of people who are there for the perks, not necessarily because they'd die for the supreme leader. But the regime has thought about this. The inner core is heavily vetted and ideologically committed. The outer layers provide mass and social penetration, even if their individual loyalty might be questionable in a crisis.
That's a really important distinction. So let's talk about the suppression role, because that's what Daniel's prompt emphasizes. The Basij's brutality is well documented. Walk me through how they actually operate when protests break out.
The Basij's suppression playbook has evolved over decades, and it's become remarkably sophisticated. During the 2009 Green Movement, which was triggered by disputed presidential elections, the Basij deployed what they called Basij resistance units. These were small, semi-autonomous cells embedded in neighborhoods and universities. They operated partly in plainclothes, which made it incredibly difficult for protesters to identify who was a government agent and who was just a guy on the street.
That's insidious. You can't tell the enforcer from the bystander.
And that's deliberate. It creates an atmosphere of pervasive surveillance and paranoia. During the Green Movement protests, Basij members were documented using motorcycles to move quickly through crowds, making targeted arrests of organizers and leaders. They'd grab someone, drag them onto a bike, and they'd be gone before the crowd could react. They also set up informal detention sites, basements, warehouses, where detainees were held and interrogated outside the formal legal system.
So the state maintains plausible deniability while the Basij does the dirty work.
That's the design. And it escalated further during the November 2019 protests, which were initially about economic grievances but spread rapidly across the country. The regime's response was the most violent crackdown since the revolution. Amnesty International documented at least 304 killed, though the actual number is likely much higher. The Basij was central to that response. They were shooting protesters at close range, sometimes with live ammunition, sometimes with shotguns loaded with birdshot at point-blank range.
And then 2022 with Mahsa Amini.
2022 was the most recent major test. The Basij deployed motorcycle units again, but also added new tactics, using facial recognition technology to identify protesters after the fact, monitoring social media in real time to track protest locations, and conducting door-to-door raids in neighborhoods where protests had occurred. The level of technological integration was a step change from 2009.
You mentioned facial recognition. That brings us to the intelligence question, which I think is the most under-discussed part of the Basij. Because Daniel's asking specifically about intelligence and counterintelligence, and I don't think most people associate those functions with a militia.
This is where the Basij really diverges from the popular image. The Basij operates an extensive domestic intelligence network. Think of it as the regime's eyes and ears at the neighborhood level. Basij members are embedded in mosques, universities, workplaces, and community organizations. They report on social behavior, political conversations, moral deviance, things like improper hijab, mixed gender gatherings, consumption of Western media.
So it's not just about cracking skulls at protests. It's about creating a surveillance society where people police themselves because they know someone's always watching.
That's the goal, and the Basij has specific units dedicated to this. There are morality enforcement patrols that monitor compliance with Islamic dress codes and behavior standards. There are university Basij units that track student activism. And there's what's been called the Cyber Basij units, specifically tasked with monitoring social media platforms, identifying dissident voices, and conducting coordinated online harassment campaigns against critics of the regime.
The Cyber Basij is fascinating to me because it shows the regime adapting to the digital age. They're not just sending guys with clubs anymore. They're running influence operations.
The cyber Basij reportedly employs thousands of people whose job is to flood Persian language social media with pro-regime content, report and take down critical posts, and in some cases dox and threaten activists. During the 2022 protests, there were documented cases of protesters being identified through their social media posts and then arrested based on that digital evidence.
So the counterintelligence function, is that separate from the surveillance, or is it all part of the same apparatus?
It's layered. The surveillance is the broad base, casting a wide net to monitor the general population. The counterintelligence function is more targeted. The Basij works to identify and infiltrate organized opposition groups, both inside Iran and in the diaspora. They monitor communications, identify networks, and map out organizational structures before moving to dismantle them.
How does that differ from what the Ministry of Intelligence does? Because Iran has a formal intelligence ministry too.
Good question. The Ministry of Intelligence and Security is the formal state intelligence agency. Think of it like the CIA equivalent, focused on both domestic and foreign intelligence with professional intelligence officers. The IRGC has its own intelligence directorate that handles security-sensitive matters, particularly related to the regime's core interests. The Basij's intelligence function is different in that it's more grassroots and pervasive. It's not professional spies. It's millions of ordinary people embedded in every level of society who serve as informants and monitors.
So it's quantity over quality in a sense.
In a sense, yes, but don't underestimate the effectiveness of that approach. A professional intelligence officer might be more skilled at tradecraft, but a Basij member who's your neighbor, your coworker, your kid's teacher, that person has access that no professional spy could easily obtain. The regime has essentially turned a significant portion of the population into an informal intelligence network.
That's terrifying when you think about it, and it raises the question of how this all serves the Revolutionary Guard's survival, because Daniel specifically asked about the Basij's role in preserving the IRGC.
This is the strategic picture. The IRGC is the regime's core power structure. It controls vast economic interests, military assets, and political influence. But the IRGC as an organization is relatively small in terms of direct personnel. The Basij is the force multiplier. It provides the IRGC with reach into every neighborhood, every institution, every family in Iran. When the regime needs to mobilize supporters for a counter-protest, the Basij can bus in thousands of loyalists within hours. When the regime needs to suppress a protest, the Basij provides the local knowledge and manpower to do it quickly.
It's like the IRGC's immune system.
That's a decent way to frame it. The Basij detects threats early through its surveillance network, responds to acute threats through its suppression capability, and maintains long-term social control through its pervasive presence. Without the Basij, the IRGC would be a powerful but relatively small military economic entity trying to control a country of nearly 90 million people. With the Basij, it has tentacles in every community.
So what happens to the IRGC if the Basij fractures or becomes unreliable? Because you mentioned earlier that a lot of the outer layers are there for economic reasons, not ideological ones.
That's the existential question for the regime. And there are signs of strain. During the 2022 protests, there were reports of Basij members refusing orders to attack protesters, of Basij offices being set on fire by their own communities, of membership cards being publicly burned. The economic incentives that draw people into the Basij become less compelling when the cost of membership is being identified as a collaborator by your own neighbors.
There's a tipping point dynamic there. The Basij works as long as most people accept it as a normal part of life. The moment it becomes socially costly to be associated with it, the whole thing could unravel fast.
And the regime knows this, which is why they invest so heavily in the ideological training and social benefits of Basij membership. They need enough true believers in the core to hold the structure together even when the periphery starts to crack. The question no one can answer with certainty is how many true believers there actually are versus how many people are just going along for the benefits.
That's the kind of thing you can only find out in a crisis. Alright, let's talk about what people should actually take away from this conversation. If you're listening and you want to understand what's happening in Iran, what should you be paying attention to regarding the Basij?
First, understand that the Basij is not just a militia. It's a comprehensive social control apparatus that combines suppression, surveillance, and ideological mobilization. When you see reporting on Iranian protests, pay attention to the Basij's specific tactics. They're more telling than the raw numbers of protesters. The regime's response to dissent reveals its priorities and its fears.
And if you want to follow this closely, outlets like Iran International and BBC Persian do excellent real-time reporting on Basij activities. They're tracking specific units, specific commanders, and specific incidents in a way that gives you a much clearer picture than Western outlets that only cover the big protest waves.
Second, remember that the Basij's intelligence function means that any organized opposition inside Iran faces extraordinary challenges. The regime has essentially made it very difficult to build sustained opposition networks because the monitoring is so pervasive. This is why a lot of the most effective Iranian opposition operates from outside the country.
And third, this connects to a broader point about authoritarian resilience. The Basij is a case study in how regimes survive not just through brute force, but through layered systems of control that make resistance feel futile. The surveillance creates fear, the suppression creates consequences, and the social benefits create complicity. Breaking through all three layers simultaneously is an enormous challenge.
The regime has been refining this system for over 4 decades. It's not invulnerable, but it's deeply entrenched.
All right, let's wrap this up. Herman, any final thoughts on where the Basij goes from here?
The big open question is how the Basij adapts if the regime faces an existential threat, a succession crisis, a major external conflict, or a protest movement that achieves critical mass. The 2022 protests showed cracks in the system, but the regime held. The next major test could look very different, especially if economic conditions continue to deteriorate and the social contract that holds the outer layers of the Basij together starts to break down.
The one thing I keep coming back to is that the Basij's greatest strength, its deep embedding in society, is also its greatest vulnerability. You can't turn on your own neighbors forever without consequences. Eventually the bill comes due.
That's the tension at the heart of the whole system. It's a structure built on a mix of fear, loyalty, and transactional benefits, and that mix is inherently unstable over the long term.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop, and big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app helps us reach new listeners. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.
This episode was produced using Xiaomi Mimo V2 Pro. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.